I want you to vividly picture the deeply depressing, highly exhausting interior of a massive, brightly lit commercial casino at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. A completely exhausted, heavily sweating middle-class worker is sitting entirely paralyzed at a massive green table, aggressively pushing the absolute last remaining chips of their highly taxed monthly salary right into the center of the board. Their heart is violently pounding inside their chest. Their eyes are completely bloodshot, and they are entirely, desperately praying to a completely invisible force for a massive, highly unlikely mathematical miracle. They genuinely believe that just one single lucky strike will completely permanently erase all of their massive, terrifying financial problems. Now, I want you to violently pan the invisible camera directly upward, entirely past the bright flashing lights, completely through the heavy ceiling, and directly into the dark, completely silent, highly luxurious private office of the incredibly wealthy casino owner. The owner is not sweating. The owner is absolutely not praying. The owner is sitting completely relaxed in a heavy leather chair, quietly sipping an incredibly expensive glass of water, looking down at the massive sea of desperate human beings. The owner deeply and profoundly understands an absolute terrifying mathematical reality that the desperately sweating gambler will absolutely never comprehend. The owner does not believe in luck. The owner completely believes in the cold, ruthless, absolutely inescapable power of massive mathematical probability. Today, I am going to completely violently expose the absolute most deeply ingrained, highly destructive psychological illness currently completely infecting the deeply asleep middle class. From the exact moment you were a completely innocent child, the massive corporate entertainment machine aggressively brainwashed you into entirely believing in the deeply toxic, entirely fake concept of human luck. They completely convinced you that massive generational wealth is simply a completely random lottery ticket, perfectly handed out by the completely invisible universe. In this massive video, we are going to violently, entirely deconstruct the terrifying mathematics of risk, explain exactly how the massive global system highly aggressively monetizes your completely blind human hope, and show you exactly how the untouchable masters of the economic universe entirely engineer massive, highly scalable systems, where the mathematical edge is permanently, absolutely locked entirely in their favor. And if you completely stick with me until the absolute end of this massive reality-shattering video, I will give you the exact step-by-step psychological escape plan to completely violently assassinate your highly toxic reliance on luck, aggressively unlearn your entirely emotional relationship with money, and forcefully transition from a desperate, heavily bleeding consumer of risk into an untouchable, mathematically lethal master of absolute probability. To entirely comprehend the massive magnitude of this psychological trap, we must deeply analyze the highly toxic industry of state-sponsored lotteries and completely blind emotional gambling. The massive, highly bloated governments completely entirely understand that the working class is deeply exhausted, completely terrified of their massive debts, and violently desperate for an immediate, magical escape. So the massive system actively, aggressively sells them brightly colored pieces of cardboard covered in completely cheap silver paint. The completely brainwashed worker eagerly, aggressively hands over their highly valuable, heavily taxed fiat currency for a mathematically impossible promise. The exact mathematical probability of winning a massive national lottery is entirely identical to being struck by lightning while simultaneously being eaten by a shark. It is an absolute, entirely mathematical zero. But the system does not sell mathematics. The system aggressively entirely sells the deeply intoxicating, highly addictive emotion of blind hope. They completely, entirely monetize your absolute desperation. Let us take an incredibly, deeply horrifying look at the exact mechanical and psychological engineering of a modern digital slot machine. This is absolutely not a simple game of chance. It is a highly advanced, heavily weaponized algorithm entirely designed by completely brilliant behavioral scientists to legally hack the human nervous system. When the completely exhausted worker pulls the heavy physical lever or pushes the brightly glowing digital button, the massive internal computer has absolutely already entirely determined the mathematical outcome in less than 1/1,000,000th of a single second. But the massive machine completely intentionally spins the brightly colored wheels for exactly 5 incredibly long seconds to aggressively entirely build a massive wave of highly toxic psychological anticipation. And the absolute most deeply evil, highly calculated mathematical weapon entirely utilized by the massive casino industry is the concept of the completely engineered near miss. The massive algorithm is completely intentionally programmed to aggressively show the completely deeply asleep worker two identical winning symbols, while placing the highly desired third winning symbol exactly 1 single millimeter below the completely required payout line. The completely brainwashed worker violently believes they were incredibly close to massive absolute victory, completely entirely unaware that the massive algorithm highly intentionally mathematically placed that physical symbol there to forcefully trigger a massive, entirely toxic release of biological dopamine directly into their highly vulnerable brain. They aggressively entirely push another highly valuable physical coin into the massive glowing machine, completely entirely addicted to the mathematically engineered illusion of human luck. But this deeply toxic mathematical illiteracy completely entirely extends far beyond the bright lights of a physical casino or a cheap scratch-off lottery ticket. It completely entirely infects the absolute way the deeply asleep middle class interacts with the massive global financial markets. When the completely average, highly emotional worker entirely decides to finally invest their highly valuable capital, they absolutely do not aggressively research highly complex corporate balance sheets. They absolutely do not deeply analyze complex cash flow statements or highly calculated global supply chains. They completely aggressively treat the massive global stock market exactly like a massive, highly volatile physical slot machine. They aggressively entirely buy highly manipulated, incredibly useless digital meme coins completely based on a random internet rumor or a completely fake social media post, entirely violently praying that the completely meaningless digital chart will aggressively explode upward overnight. Now we must entirely completely expose the massive, highly toxic industry of the completely fake online financial trading guru. The highly naive, completely desperate worker frantically scrolls through massive digital feeds, looking for a magical absolute savior. They completely entirely stumble across a highly charismatic young person standing aggressively entirely in front of a massive rented luxury sports car, completely violently promising entirely guaranteed massive daily returns on highly complex options trades. The deeply asleep worker absolutely completely ignores the fundamental laws of massive global mathematics and eagerly aggressively hands over their highly valuable credit card to entirely completely purchase a completely useless digital course. The completely fake guru is absolutely not a massive master of the global financial markets. They are simply a highly efficient, incredibly manipulative, psychological marketer entirely completely monetizing the deeply toxic middle-class desire for an immediate, entirely effortless, massive overnight lottery win. When the completely inevitable, highly calculated, massive corporate market dump violently entirely occurs, the deeply asleep worker loses absolutely everything, completely entirely screaming that the massive system is entirely completely rigged against them. The massive system is absolutely entirely rigged, but it is entirely completely rigged by the cold, highly calculating masters of absolute mathematics, who completely entirely prey on the deeply emotional, highly undisciplined, entirely completely uneducated amateur. You must completely entirely understand that the true, untouchable masters of the economic universe absolutely never, ever rely on the completely fake concept of invisible human luck. They absolutely completely despise the entirely toxic, highly dangerous emotion of completely blind hope. The true global elite aggressively completely view the entire modern economic world as a massive, entirely readable, highly structured matrix of highly calculated probabilities. Let us completely thoroughly analyze the highly disciplined, entirely robotic mindset of a true, mathematically lethal professional risk manager. They absolutely entirely do not aggressively throw their highly valuable physical capital entirely blindly into the cold wind. If they are completely entirely operating in the massive, highly complex world of advanced professional sports analysis, deeply studying the absolute specific statistics of a highly competitive international tennis tournament, they absolutely entirely do not place a financial wager based on a highly emotional gut feeling or a completely entirely blind loyalty to a highly popular physical athlete. They absolutely completely start with a highly calculated, heavily protected initial capital base, perhaps exactly $100, and they aggressively completely utilize massive, entirely cold mathematical data models to completely entirely find absolute specific inefficiencies in the massive global betting market. They do not aggressively entirely pray for a single massive lottery-style win. They completely systematically violently execute hundreds of highly calculated microtransactions where they mathematically completely possess a tiny, entirely undeniable statistical edge. We must deeply and profoundly explore the absolute, massive, terrifying mathematics of the completely, entirely structural house edge. A massive corporate global casino absolutely does not need to completely, entirely win absolutely every single financial hand dealt on the physical green table. They only mathematically entirely need to secure an absolute specific statistical advantage of perhaps exactly 51%. That tiny, completely seemingly microscopic 1% mathematical advantage is the absolute foundation of massive global multi-billion-dollar empires. The highly desperate gambler completely, entirely focuses heavily on the incredibly random, massive outcome of one single, specific, isolated event. The entirely awake, highly disciplined casino owner completely, absolutely, completely focuses entirely on the massive, undeniable mathematical certainty of exactly 1 million completely, entirely aggregated events over a massive, highly extended timeline. Over a massive timeline, that tiny mathematical edge aggressively entirely compounds into a massive, untouchable physical mountain of pure, glowing, golden wealth. They entirely, completely, absolutely, entirely remove the completely flawed, deeply toxic human emotion from the massive overall financial equation. The absolutely terrifying mathematical reality is that in exactly every single financial transaction on the entire physical planet, there is absolutely always an aggressive consumer of entirely blind risk and a highly calculating, completely entirely protected owner of massive absolute probability. When a completely naive, deeply asleep worker eagerly, aggressively, entirely takes out a massive high-interest auto loan to completely buy an incredibly rapidly depreciating physical luxury car, to completely, entirely, deeply impress physical people they absolutely deeply hate, they are aggressively, completely, entirely consuming massive toxic financial risk. The massive global commercial bank that mathematically, completely, entirely calculated the exact, highly specific statistical default rate of that particular worker demographic and aggressively, entirely, completely bundled that highly toxic physical loan into a massive, incredibly complex corporate financial derivative is the untouchable, highly protected, absolute owner of the entirely massive probability. The completely brainwashed, entirely deeply asleep middle class is aggressively, entirely addicted to the massive, highly toxic biological dopamine hit of the completely, entirely unknown mathematical outcome, entirely. Completely paying a massive physical financial premium for the entirely, completely, entirely fake psychological thrill of the blind gamble. The true untouchable elite are entirely, completely, absolutely addicted to the massive, highly predictable, completely, entirely boring, incredibly absolute mathematics of completely guaranteed, massive, long-term compounding yield. If you are listening to this exact specific sentence completely right now, and you feel a massive, completely heavy, physical iron blindfold violently, entirely ripping completely off your exhausted face, entirely completely realizing that your absolute entire financial life has been aggressively entirely dictated by highly toxic, emotional, blind hope, instead of entirely completely cold, ruthless, massive, absolute mathematics. You are officially completely stepping entirely out of the massive toxic casino of the deeply asleep middle class. But I absolutely completely must issue a very serious, incredibly entirely urgent psychological warning right now. Violently completely assassinating your deeply ingrained, highly cultural belief in entirely completely fake invisible luck is an incredibly painful, entirely terrifying, deep psychological process. Your highly conditioned, entirely completely biological human brain will violently, aggressively, completely, entirely fight you, entirely, completely, desperately begging to completely return to the deeply comforting, entirely fake, highly emotional fantasy of the massive, completely immediate overnight lottery win. You must be completely, entirely, absolutely mentally prepared to entirely endure this absolute, terrifying, massive psychological withdrawal in order to entirely, completely secure your permanent, absolute, massive mathematical freedom and entirely, completely, absolutely reclaim your own highly valuable, completely, entirely sovereign human mind. Grab a massive, heavy iron pen and a completely blank piece of physical paper right now. Entirely, completely. Eliminate absolutely all deeply toxic physical distractions completely, entirely around you. Violently, entirely turn completely off your glowing, brightly colored television screen and strictly, entirely, completely prepare to execute this absolutely actionable, highly structured, step-by-step escape plan to permanently, completely, violently assassinate your deeply toxic, entirely, completely heavy reliance on blind hope, aggressively, completely unlearn your completely emotional, entirely, completely, entirely toxic relationship with your massive, valuable capital, and forcefully, entirely, completely transition from a highly drained, heavily bleeding, desperately, completely, entirely hopeful gambler into an untouchable, mathematically highly lethal, absolute master of massive, absolute probability. Rule number 1. You must completely, radically, and violently, entirely reprogram your absolute, entire, deep psychological relationship with the completely, entirely fake societal concept of human invisible luck. You must permanently, entirely, completely, entirely stop using the word luck in your absolute, entire daily human vocabulary. You must deeply and profoundly, entirely, absolutely understand that absolutely everything in the massive, physical, and entirely highly complex financial universe is entirely governed by exact specific cause, exact specific effect, and highly calculated, entirely absolute probability. You must aggressively and ruthlessly, entirely, completely stop participating in absolutely any physical or digital system where the massive structural mathematical edge is actively, heavily stacked, completely, entirely, aggressively against you. You must completely, violently swear absolutely off entirely, absolutely all state-sponsored massive lotteries, completely, entirely, absolutely abandon highly emotional, entirely, completely, entirely uneducated blind stock market trading, and entirely, absolutely refuse to ever again aggressively hand your highly valuable physical capital completely over to an entirely massive, completely, absolutely, entirely, completely system built on completely, entirely blind, random chance. Your absolute new, completely permanent, highly protected goal is to completely only play entirely specific games where you entirely, completely, mathematically possess the absolute massive, undeniably, completely, entirely structural mathematical advantage. Rule number 2. You must aggressively, entirely initiate a massive, absolutely relentless, completely, entirely aggressive campaign to completely transition your absolute entire physical financial existence from the incredibly highly vulnerable, deeply, entirely asleep consumer of random blind risk into the absolute, highly protected, completely, entirely mathematically secure owner of the massive global casino. You must completely, violently, entirely redirect your massive, valuable human energy into entirely aggressively building massive, highly scalable, incredibly complex digital systems and completely, entirely acquiring highly valuable, massive, heavy cash-flowing physical assets that completely, entirely, absolutely, entirely generate massive structural wealth entirely, completely, regardless of incredibly, completely random daily global events. You absolutely, entirely, completely, entirely must stop aggressively trying to accurately, perfectly predict the highly volatile, completely, entirely random, massive, short-term, highly, completely erratic movements of the massive, incredibly complex global financial markets. Instead, you must aggressively, entirely, completely, absolutely focus your absolute valuable, completely, highly, entirely, completely time on, entirely, completely building a massive, highly impenetrable, heavy titanium corporate business structure that entirely, completely, absolutely profits entirely from the highly predictable, completely undeniable, massive, long-term, highly repetitive behaviors of the completely deeply asleep mass consumer class. Rule number 3, you must completely, entirely embrace the absolute, completely undeniable, highly structural superpower of entirely, completely, absolutely ruthless, completely, highly advanced robotic emotional detachment. The absolute greatest, most highly lethal, entirely, completely massive financial weapon you completely, entirely, absolutely possess is a highly disciplined, completely, entirely, absolutely, entirely, perfectly controlled human mind, completely, entirely emptied of absolutely all massive, toxic physical, financial anxiety, and completely, entirely blind emotional hope. When you actively, aggressively, entirely, completely deploy your highly valuable, massive, absolute capital, whether you are completely, entirely analyzing massive, complex, entirely structural, commercial real estate business deals, or deeply, entirely studying highly specific, completely, entirely obscure mathematical statistical anomalies in massive global professional sports betting markets, you absolutely, entirely, completely, absolutely must operate exactly entirely like a completely cold, highly efficient, absolutely, completely, entirely massive supercomputer. You completely, entirely must mathematically size your highly calculated, entirely absolute positions entirely perfectly to completely guarantee that absolutely no single completely random negative daily outcome can completely, violently, entirely, absolutely destroy your massive overall global financial empire. You must completely, entirely, absolutely, completely fall entirely deeply in love with the incredibly highly, completely, absolutely, completely boring, entirely, highly, incredibly repetitive long-term process of aggressive, massive, entirely, completely, absolutely mathematical exponential compounding. Let us completely, entirely, thoroughly summarize this brutal, completely, entirely, incredibly mind-bending, mathematical, absolute reality before you completely go out and take massive, entirely life-changing, completely aggressive action today. The massive traditional societal concept of invisible human luck and completely, entirely blind emotional hope is a perfectly, completely, entirely, highly structurally designed, highly efficient, completely massive, deep psychological trap. They aggressively and completely, constantly, completely weaponize your highly natural, completely, entirely, deeply biological human desperation to legally, aggressively, entirely, completely extract your incredibly valuable, massive human capital, completely converting your entirely natural, highly deep desire for true, absolute freedom into deep, highly predictable, entirely, completely massive structural corporate revenue. The massive traditional societal behavior to constantly, aggressively, completely, entirely seek out highly volatile, completely entirely massive, high risk, completely blind gambles, while entirely, completely, absolutely ignoring the massive, undeniable structural power of incredibly slow, highly calculated, completely entirely massive mathematical probability is the absolute most deeply dangerous, incredibly highly toxic, and entirely mathematically completely destructive, entirely, completely, entirely lifestyle in the modern world. It mathematically, completely, absolutely, entirely guarantees that you will completely, entirely, absolutely remain a highly drained, constantly, heavily, completely, entirely bleeding target, permanently, completely, entirely trapped on an incredibly deeply exhausting, highly, entirely, completely rusty, heavy iron hamster wheel of entirely, completely, endless, deeply emotional financial desperation. The absolute, entirely only possible mathematical way to completely win this entirely, completely, heavily, completely, entirely, completely rigged game is to violently, entirely, completely unplug yourself from the entirely massive, completely, highly toxic emotional casino, aggressively, entirely, completely embrace massive, incredibly highly calculated probability, and forcefully, entirely, completely adopt the invisible, entirely untouchable, completely absolute God-like, incredibly, entirely, completely lifestyle of an entirely mathematically, completely, absolutely, highly disciplined global producer, exactly, completely, entirely like a true master of the absolute economic universe. If this deeply terrifying, entirely, incredibly reality-shattering, massive mathematical information finally, completely, entirely opened your deeply, highly, entirely exhausted eyes, if you completely, entirely feel like I just violently, entirely ripped you, entirely, completely out of the highly toxic, incredibly massive emotional casino, and finally completely handed you the absolute dark structural truth about exactly why the massive, untouchable global elite completely, absolutely, entirely, always completely win, then I absolutely, entirely need you to completely, violently, completely destroy that massive blue like button and aggressively, entirely subscribe completely, entirely, completely, entirely to the channel right now. You absolutely, completely, entirely, absolutely cannot afford to completely, entirely miss the extremely high level, highly aggressive, completely, entirely, absolute wealth building mathematical strategies we have completely, entirely, absolutely coming up next on this massive reality, completely breaking, incredibly highly advanced channel. And speaking of massive, highly complex financial traps that are specifically, completely, entirely, incredibly structurally engineered to completely, absolutely, violently, completely lock up your highly valuable, massive, absolute capital and mathematically, absolutely, completely guarantee that the exact same massive, completely, incredibly, highly structural corporate system violently, heavily, aggressively, entirely extracts massive, completely, entirely unjustified, entirely, highly, completely massive fees from your massive, completely, absolutely life savings while entirely blindly betting your massive, incredibly, entirely, completely, absolute hard-earned money in their own massive, global, heavily, completely structural casino? If you truly, completely, entirely, absolutely want to deeply, completely, entirely understand the absolute biggest, most highly, entirely manipulative, mathematical, completely incredible lie ever entirely, completely told by the massive, incredibly traditional retirement industry, and exactly how the completely highly standardized, completely, absolutely highly structured concept of the standard 401k plan is a massive, incredibly toxic, completely highly structured psychological prison designed entirely, completely, to absolutely, entirely lock the exact specific money you heavily, entirely, completely earned away until you are entirely, completely, incredibly, absolutely too old to actually completely, entirely enjoy it. You absolutely, entirely, completely, absolutely have to entirely, completely, absolutely watch this incredibly massive, highly specifically, entirely, completely structured video right here on the bright glowing screen. In it, I completely and incredibly, entirely, ruthlessly, violently, entirely, absolutely, entirely break down the absolute ultimate Wall Street, highly, completely structural lockup illusion. And I completely, absolutely, entirely, perfectly show you exactly why the true, incredibly, highly advanced global elite completely, absolutely, entirely, highly, completely refuse to hand their highly valuable, massive capital over to greedy, incredibly highly paid, massive traditional mutual fund managers, choosing instead to aggressively, entirely, completely, entirely, absolutely, completely build massive, highly complex, private global empires they completely, mathematically, entirely control today. Click that massive, completely, entirely video, completely, entirely right now. Your incredibly, highly absolute, incredibly, completely, incredibly, entirely future, highly calculating, absolutely, untethered, and permanently, entirely, completely, perfectly, financially free, completely, absolutely, highly, incredibly, absolute self, will eternally, completely, absolutely, entirely, completely, entirely. Thank you. I will entirely, completely see you entirely, completely, absolutely over there on the completely, entirely, absolutely, completely other massive, highly specific, completely absolute side